Hey guys, welcome back to another video. In this one we're going to be talking about all things solvents, and we're starting right now. I'm Abigail and I make videos designed to help you improve your art skills. Now back to this video. First of all, what is a solvent? A solvent is something that dissolves another thing. In the case of colored pencils, the solvent will dissolve the binder, which is basically just the glue that holds the pencil pigment together and to the wood casing. By dissolving the binder, you cause the pencil pigment to soak into the paper, essentially staining the paper and getting rid of the white graininess that is caused by the tooth of the paper. This gives a much smoother and more blended appearance. There are many different solvents to choose from, like Mona Lisa Odorless Paint Thinner, Zest-It, and Gamsol. I personally use Gamsol since that is the only one that I can find near me. However, they all work the same. You do not want to drink this and you should avoid inhaling it in as much as possible. The Gamsol comes in a screw-top container, but after it has been opened it can leak, so I recommend storing it in a place that can't easily be knocked over and transferring a small amount of it into a sealed container for when you are actually using it. Now you may be wondering if you can use something like baby oil, turpentine, water, or other household or hardware store products. I would not recommend these products since while they may be fine for practice, they won't last in the long run, since it's not meant to be an art supply. If you use any of these other products, you will most likely alter how fast the drawing is, meaning that over time your colors will fade and your paper will yellow much more rapidly than if you had used a solvent that is made for art. As for water, it will not work at all to blend colored pencils. This is because all pencils are either wax-based or oil-based. The solvent breaks apart these bindings. Instead of blending the colored pencil, the water will just rest on top. So why do artists use solvent? Now I can't speak for all artists, but I for one use it to avoid the wrist pain that I experience with burnishing. It can also speed up the process in comparison to layering. If you would like to learn more about these techniques, feel free to check out this video. Obviously, solvent isn't right for everyone. If you are sensitive to smells or have sensitive skin around chemicals, then this may not be a good option for you. Moving on, let's talk about what paper is best for using solvents on. First off, don't use printer paper or any thin sketchbook paper. These won't work well mainly because they aren't thick enough and aren't meant to handle liquid media, meaning that the solvent will soak through the paper, giving you less time to spread it evenly. It will also leave oil stains on the back of the paper and an oily ring around the area you are trying to blend out. Instead, I'd recommend something like a good quality watercolor paper or mixed media paper. The papers I prefer for this are the Arches or Fabriano Artistico 140-pound hot-pressed watercolor paper. These are both thick papers, meaning that the solvent won't soak through or cause other previously mentioned problems. Now let's get into how you can actually use the solvent, starting with what tools to use to apply it. The first tool you can use is a blending stump. Now you may be familiar with this tool from graphite drawing. However, we won't be using it dry. Rather, we dip one end of the stump into the solvent, being careful not to soak up a lot. Then you dab off the excess solvent onto a rag before blending out the area of colored pencil. Now here are the pros and cons to this tool. The pro is that you will have more control than you would with any of the other tools I will mention. The con, however, is that you will have to switch out your blending stumps in between colors since the stumps can't be cleaned, making it one of the least cost-effective methods. The next tool you can use is a cotton bud. This tool works similarly to the blending stump, needing only a small amount of solvent in order to be effective. Because the tip is round on a cotton bud, it will have slightly less control than a blending stump. Just like the blending stump, it can't be cleaned well, meaning that you will have to switch it out frequently. Cotton buds are cheaper than blending stumps though, making them slightly more affordable in comparison to blending stumps. The third tool you can use, and my personal preference, is the paintbrush. This is my favorite tool just because I can clean it off instead of replacing it. Yes, if you treat your brushes poorly, you will have to replace them. However, if you take good care of them, you will find that you rarely need to replace them. If you would like to see how I clean my brushes after using solvent, Inktense, or watercolor, then feel free to check out this video. When using this tool, you just need to dip the paintbrush into the solvent. You don't need to be nearly as careful with how much solvent you absorb with the paintbrush in comparison to a blending stump or cotton bud. However, I still recommend dabbing off any excess onto the side of the container and then onto a rag towel to avoid wasting any solvent. This will also help you to avoid the first possible mistake you can make when using solvent, which is puddling the solvent onto your paper. This mistake will negatively result in damaging the tooth of the paper from the oversaturation, or leaving an unwanted oily ring around the area you tried to blend. The next mistake I've seen and done myself many times is using too little solvent. Here's what it will look like if you didn't use enough. If you didn't use enough solvent, that's okay. All you need to do is try again with a little more solvent on your tool. Now sometimes the amount of solvent you are using isn't the problem. Instead, it's having too little pencil pigment on the paper to be blended by the solvent. This is a very common problem, especially when you are using cheap colored pencils, since they just don't hold a lot of pigment to begin with. However, this is really easy to fix. All you need to do is add more layers of pigment. The more you use solvent, the more you will know how many layers you need. However, if you are just starting out, I recommend aiming for 5 to 7 layers. Now when it comes to applying these layers of pigment, there are 2 different methods you can go with. The first and most recommended way is to apply the layers in a circular motion. This way there are very few start and stop points. Those harsh start and stop points are more difficult to blend out than the other areas, so having less of them makes it easier to blend out those areas. However, this is a very time-consuming way of applying your pigment, so some prefer the second method, which is to apply the pigment with random pencil strokes. This is a lot quicker, however you create more start and stop points, making this way more difficult to blend out. This comes down to personal preference, so I recommend you try both and see which method works best for you. Alright, now let's get into what brushes you should use for blending colored pencils with solvent. One of the first things to consider is what size of a brush you should use. This may seem obvious, but you should pick the size of brush that will most easily blend out whatever area you are working on. Because of this, for most projects, I use multiple brushes in a range of sizes. For the large areas, I will use a large brush, then I switch to a small brush for the edges around the subjects, and any areas smaller than what I would use a large brush for. Lastly, for the tiniest of details, I will use a fine liner. Try a few brushes to see which size is good for each area. If you find that it is taking quite a bit of time to blend out a large area with the brush you are using, then consider switching to a larger one. On the other hand, if you are having a hard time keeping the bristles of the brush within the area you are trying to blend, then consider switching to a smaller brush or a fine liner. Now that we know the size of the brush to use, we need to consider whether to use a soft brush or a stiff brush. In this first example, you see me using a soft watercolor brush. You will notice that it takes quite a while for this type of brush to blend all the pigment out, which for some is very inconvenient. However, because it is so soft, you can't damage the tooth of the paper as easily, making it good for beginners. On the other hand, you have stiff brushes. These brushes will get the job done much quicker, but may also damage the tooth of the paper, so be careful to use a light hand when blending with this type of brush. Ultimately, how stiff or soft your brushes are won't make a dramatic difference on your final drawing, so this will mostly come down to personal preference. Whether you use a stiff brush or a soft brush, I prefer using brushes that have a round edge to avoid harsh edges in the areas you blend out. We now know what solvent is, tools to use it, the sizes of brushes to use, and whether stiff or soft brushes are a better option. Now I'm going to show you how to and how not to use it. First, make sure your brush is clean. I can't tell you how many times I've had to cover up unwanted colors in my drawing just because I didn't take that little bit of extra time to check to see if my brush had any colors on it from other projects. Next, you are going to dip your brush in the solvent and dab off any excess onto a rag. Apply very little to the paper with a light hand to avoid oversaturating the paper and damaging the tooth of the paper. If nothing seems to change, do it again, leaving slightly more solvent on the brush. It is so much easier to add more solvent to your brush when you don't have enough than to oversaturate the paper and have to fight the damaged tooth for the rest of the project. That said, you can use more solvent in the beginning, but then towards the end you want to use less and less to avoid lifting the colored pencil from the paper. After you have blended an area with solvent, let it dry for 10 to 15 minutes between layers. If it is not dry, you will damage the tooth of the paper, making it almost sponge-like. This will make it harder to add more layers and to keep your pencil strokes consistent. If you would like to know more about how to keep your pencil strokes consistent, consider checking out this video. Alright, now I'm going to show you my absolute favorite way to use solvent. Now this way of using solvent has less to do with the solvent and more to do with the paper I'm using. My favorite way to use solvent is to blend colored pencils on pastel mat. This is a lot faster than any of the other papers and gives you some cool effects. The first thing that I like about this paper is that I don't need as many layers as I do on watercolor paper. If I don't have many layers on my paper when I try to blend, it looks a lot like watercolor painting. And if I have more layers, I will have more control and it will look like a thick paint, but then I can also add more details on top to make it look like a colored pencil piece done on watercolor paper, just done in a lot less time. If you would like to try pastel mat, consider checking out this video where I show you how to make it yourself. And that is it for this video. If you enjoyed it, consider checking out this playlist with some of my other tutorials, and feel free to share your questions or video ideas with me in the comments. Anyway guys, thank you for watching, and until next time, God bless.